Johan, great to see you and good afternoon.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about your book and your ideas this afternoon. To me, the first question is the obvious one. Tell me a little bit about yourself, your background, and how you became so passionate about this idea of effective strategy execution.
Yeah, it's quite a niche subject to become an expert in, I suppose.
Yeah.
Obviously, my name is Johan. I spent my early career really in the trenches of strategy execution. I worked as a management consultant, specializing in strategy execution projects between my mid-20s and early 30s, and then through multiple roles, chief strategy officer and so forth. I had the ability to really dig into strategy execution. So I was never really part of the formation of strategy, but the execution part. And that's really where strategy either takes flight or fumbles, And I got more and more interested into the systems behind what makes strategy works. And that's one of the benefits of the perspective of a consultant. Because compared to if you're more of a line manager, even if you're the CEO, you only see strategy in the context of your specific company, for example.
Yeah.
But the consultant view is a little bit different because you can see similarities between companies. And you can see, okay, that success had actually more to do with the underlying market than the brilliance of the CEO, or the opposite. So you can start to figure out what are the true successes behind successful execution. And then I'm kind of an obsessive person. I really like to get into details of what works and what doesn't. So,
and presumably you can find commonalities. So you're looking into a whole bunch of companies instead of being, as you say, encapsulated in one organization.
Yeah.
And you can think, well, hang on a second, the way that failed is similar to the way that failed.
Yeah.
And on the other side of the coin, the way that succeeded is similar to that way that succeeded, which allows you to presumably normalize for things like market conditions.
Exactly.
For things like ability or experience of the CEO, and be able to define, oh, hang on a second, we've got something here that when people try to do a strategy this particular way, it tends not to work.
Yeah.
And when they do it this way, it tends to work.
Yeah, and the truth is that there's more commonalities across companies than there are differences. I do think that a lot of, especially senior leaders that have been within a single industry for a long time, I think they experience that their industry is way more unique than it actually is.
Right.
So strategy, if you really boil it down and then try to dumb it down to the fundamental level, is driving behavior change across large organizations. So a lot of it has to do with pretty simple principles behind behavior change.
Yeah.
So that's what you tend to figure out. And we've done a bunch of studies ourselves, and there is a bunch of studies in general within this area, because obviously the business case is huge of solving it, because that's the baseline where we come in to this whole field of study. 90% of strategies fail to execute the financial potential that's within them on time. So obviously if you can be a part of solving that, the willingness to pay and the business value for that is huge. So there's really good fundamental science that is backing up this field. The question is, how do we get that science into people's hands?
Well, I was going to say, one thing that struck me when you were saying that is I suspect the first challenge you might have as a consultant come into an organization to say to the CEO, to say to the C-suite, well, listen, my friends, you may think you're unique, but I can tell you that you are not.
Yeah, I do think that's true. Pretty quickly they accept that as true, because you come in as a subject matter expert and you can quite quickly, I would imagine this is pretty similar for if you're a psychologist. You pretty quickly can establish that position of knowledge, and then you can quite quickly move on to, okay, this is the guidance that you need. I do think that the primary problem within really the C-suite, like the senior leaders of the company, is more accepting that a lot of the problems that our strategy face is not really somebody else's problem, and it arises because we have some cultural issues of accountability further out in the organization. The problem is way more around their behaviors. And that's one of the core things that science points to, that one of the biggest challenges, and I'm sure we'll talk about more about this as we move along, but it's the ability to prioritize.
Yeah.
And what's interesting about that is that there's really nobody else in the company that has the mandate to start prioritizing outside of the C-suite.
Yeah.
So if they fail to prioritize, it will become impossible for anybody else to really prioritize, because those people will be bombarded from above. And what are they going to do? It's their manager who tells them that this and this and this and this, and everything is important at the same time. So they're kind of set up to fail a lot of the times.
As humans, we are almost conditioned to be reactive, aren't we?
Yeah.
So, which is if you're being asked to, you're being challenged as a
Yeah.
CEO, you're being challenged as a C-suite by your managers, by your people, your instinctive response tends to always be to do something about it.
Yeah.
And actually, what you're saying is that can be quite dangerous, because unless you are able to create a roster of priorities and keep that relatively lean, you are probably going to fail to deliver on any of them.
Yeah, it's interesting. The road to hell can be paved with good intentions, right? And I think that, yes, there are external pressures facing these roles. That's for sure true. I also think it's more simple than that. These people are ambitious.
Yeah.
And saying no to good ideas is deeply, deeply uncomfortable if you're an ambitious individual. And the point about saying no is that you have to say no to not just the bad ideas, anybody can do that, but you have to say no to the good ideas, and the really good ideas, in order to be able to execute on the game-changing great ideas.
Yeah.
So the science behind this says that there's an inverse relationship between the number of goals that you have and the number of goals that you can successfully execute.
Right.
So the more goals that you have, the less you will actually start to achieve, because each goal requires attention, resources, focus from people in your organization.
Whether you achieve it or not, it's still...
Whether you achieve it or not, exactly. So every second that you spend on one thing is a second that you don't spend on another thing. So it's about getting an acceptance, a true acceptance within this group of people, whoever they are, that if we accept it as true, that we can't, it's a zero-sum game with time. So the wider the spread of focus, the less we will actually achieve. And if that is true, wouldn't we rather be in a situation where we actually control what we achieve? And that's the principle behind what I call in the book most important goals. So the golden rule is that for any one team, you can't really have more than 2 or 3 goals. And if you look into a random team...
As few as that,
yeah,
2 or 3.
Yeah. That's the science. And as soon as you go to 4 to 5 total goals, you tend to achieve 1 to 2.
Right.
So the science says that if you have between 2 and 3 goals, you typically achieve those 2 or 3 goals. Obviously, a little bit depending on ambition level of goal, but keeping it reasonable. If you move to 4 to 5, just that little incremental change, the number that you achieve goes actually down to 1 to 2.
Right.
And the secondary problem is that you don't decide what 1 to 2 out of those 4 to 5 goals that you achieve. So,
it becomes random.
yeah, it becomes random. Exactly. So you
this
invite chance.
This is absolutely fascinating, because, of course, the instinctive thought would be the opposite. I'll tell you what I'll do. There's an old English idiom. Don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Okay, yeah, I got it.
And the idea of that is, if you have a number of baskets, if you like, with eggs in each of them, some of the baskets you're going to drop, some of the eggs are going to get stolen by a fox or what have you. But you'll get some of those eggs home, and you'll have achieved something.
Yeah.
But actually what you're saying is that the opposite of that is that by having a number of baskets here, the greater number of baskets you have, the fewer you are likely to bring home and be able to eat.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure if the analogy of the fox carries true, because I do think that you would probably carry home at least a part of the financial potential that you have on the table.
Right.
But the thing is that, especially when you talk about strategy, taking a really big step back, what strategy typically tends to be about is that we as a company, we're on a kind of a financial trend. Maybe we grow 4% a year. That's been our track record the last 4 years. Strategy is about clarifying, okay, our ambition from owners or whoever is actually that we need to grow at 8%. So we need to improve versus a trend. So strategy typically is about creating clarity around where is that improvement coming from. And then if you bring it back to, okay, maybe you can carry home a basket or two. The baskets that you carry home are the things that would keep you on your current trend.
Yeah.
So they wouldn't ever move the needle. Those are the comfortable things that you do anyway.
Yeah.
So you just start to create a lot of overhead of kind of goal management within companies and templates to fill in, but you're not moving the needle in any way, shape, or form.
You were doing what you would otherwise have done.
Exactly. Yeah.
But you've actually added on, you've pork barreled to some degree all of the goal management stuff, which is taking time, energy, and focus away from you with no real net
Exactly.
gain.
Yeah.
It's interesting. The title of the book has got a great title, The Execution Revolution.
Yeah.
The most interesting word, I think, in that title is this word revolution.
Mm-hmm.
You are trying to create a revolution in business.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, I don't think it's niche what you're trying to do. I think it's niche that you're passionate about it, but perhaps more people should be passionate about this because businesses struggle with it. But what is this revolution that you want to start?
To me, it's two things. One is the fundamental understanding of that strategy isn't a single master stroke from within the boardroom. Strategy is moving a lot of people in a unified direction. So the word revolution comes from that we need people to start to engage with these ideas. So that's one part of it, that it's not just about you and your personal journey. It's that once you've perhaps seen the light or gotten some really good ideas about execution, I want you to bring people within your ecosystem into it, because that's the only way that you'll be able to affect change. So I want to install a better operating system within companies, if that makes sense. So that's one part of it. The other part, which is more important to me, more as an individual, is when I think about our current kind of society, there are really big challenges that my generation needs to face, that my daughter's generation needs to face. And we're talking about everything from climate change to changing demographics, AI, whatever. Currently, we are really bad at executing change.
Yeah.
And if I can be a little part of making the world a better place in terms of increasing our ability to execute on these really important issues, that is super important to me.
I mean, the interesting thing in the book is that we are absolutely hopeless at executing change. I mean, let's call it what it is. I mean, there's this staggering statistic in this book, which blows your mind and should really blow the mind of any CEO or any member of any C-suite anywhere, which is that 90% of strategic initiatives fail.
Yeah.
Only 1 in 10 actually succeeds.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that is an absolute indictment of the way we're running our businesses, isn't it?
Yeah, it's and the interesting thing is that it's allowed to go on. To me, to be honest. And to tell you a little bit of a kind of secret within the trade, like how come nobody really finds this out? So there's this super interesting study that's done by Harvard Business Review that points out that on average, if you were to quantify a strategy on the financial, like, okay, so in 3 years, we're supposed to turn over $100 million, and currently we turn over 50, whatever. Over a 3-year period, you deliver on average only 63% of that financial potential.
Yeah.
What happens in reality is that most strategies are financially built around this idea of hockey sticks, right? So you have year 1, well, we're doing all of the change works. We won't really see the financial effect year 1. See a little bit of it year 2, and year 3, that's where you have the kind of massive gains. Yeah. After a year, you realize that you're way behind.
Yep.
So you start revising budgets. And after the second year, that old strategy that you had, it feels obsolete. So you start building this new kind of strategic framework to start hiding that. And it's just a game of kind of, okay, that 100 million obviously is not going to work. We have this new 2028 budget, and that says 66 million. So you start substituting the previous strategies to kind of hide this problem. But the problem is huge. The problem is absolutely huge. And I also think that as our society is going through increasing amounts of disruptions, the ability to kind of handle change will be more and more a question of survival for companies. The speed in which you can enact change, that will be a real competitive advantage.
Your example about sort of, making tweaks to existing strategies that are obviously failing is an interesting one. To what extent, there's a comedy show here in the UK called Only Fools and Horses, and there is a classic sketch called Trigger's Broom, where this character Trigger starts. He's a warehouse man for a local authority or a street cleaner, and he has a broom that the council gives him. And having done this job for 20 years, he's sitting in the cafe or the pub with his friends, and he says, "I've had this broom for 20 years, and it's never let me down." And his friend said, "Really?" He said, "Yes, I've changed the handle 15 times, and I've changed the head 15 times." And of course, it's not the same broom at all.
Yeah.
It's been changed, multiple times. But in his perception, it's the same broom. And it strikes me that's what's going on with these strategic initiatives: is that businesses launch a strategic initiative.
Mm-hmm.
Say we're going to put 100 billion or 100 million behind this initiative. After year one, after 18 months, it's becoming clear that it's failing. So they try to tweak it to such a degree that it's no longer the original strategy. And the strategy has sort of become a sort of horny-headed monster that has taken on a life of its own.
Yeah.
And by its constant update, what you end up with is a series of what are effectively separate strategies, all of which are failing.
Yeah. And I imagine the guy at the pub, in all honesty, is trying to keep his head down and say that this too will pass.
Yeah.
That to me, that's the perception of corporate has a new strategy within companies, because it has a tendency, and maybe let's bring some structure into the components, if you will, of the methodology. So we talked about setting goals, and the first concept is called most important goals, and it's the ability to prioritize what truly matters to you.
Yeah.
But those typically would express what you want to achieve. So those would be the 100 million, like the ultimate financial outcome of what I want to do. Then you come into the next discipline, which is about strategic initiatives. In the best of worlds, those are explaining what's the path to these new 100 millions that we want to achieve. So they are way more about the how of things. So a strategic initiative within a company, and I would imagine that most of the audience has seen it within their own companies as well, it's called automation, for example.
Yeah.
Or this is our sustainability, or this is our whatever it might be, the launch of a new product, or we're entering into this new market. So in companies, these have multiple different names. They're called growth pillars, focus areas, but they're all really the same thing, and it dates back to the 50s. Management by objectives was the kind of originator of this. What I feel is the bigger problem. So when we talk about goals, the biggest problem is prioritization. When we talk about these initiatives, the biggest problem is our inability to move beyond the buzzword.
Right.
So that is typically where a lot of strategies in practice fail, because at the C-suite level, right, we're making this big bet on automation. But when you actually start scratching the surface about, okay, what are we about to automate? Or is it more a general approach that we like automation? It's very, very shallow in terms of detail. So the PowerPoint slide looks really good. It's paraded across the company, I'll tell you. But in terms of, okay, what does this actually mean in terms of the projects, the milestones, the deliverables, and what's the actual business value behind it? That's a big part of what's lacking.
It becomes nebulous.
Yeah.
It's nebulous. It's sort of big grand mission statements with very little detail underneath them.
Yeah.
Which means when it actually comes to the delivering this thing, to executing it, the people who are charged with executing it don't know what they're supposed to be doing.
No, exactly. And then you have two types of people. You might have the guy with the broom who says that this too shall pass, and I continue doing my operational job to the best of my abilities, and then neglect this as corporate jargon. Yeah. Which is, to be honest, quite a good way of going about business as well, because it is corporate jargon by this point. And then you have the other kind of group of people, and obviously there are more nuances in this, but the other group of people are quite ambitious and think that planning for the future is quite interesting. So they try to interpret automation or sustainability or whatever it might be to the best of their abilities. So what happens then is that ideas start to kind of pop up from the ground up. And initially the CEO or the directors or whoever, they interpret this as quite nice. They said this is engagement. People are engaging with automation. And compared to zero engagement, yes, that's good. But the problem, again, comes back to prioritization, because then you have a lot of not interconnected kind of ideas and projects that maybe if you squint, they're all part of an automation initiative, but there's no coherence around it. And there's no real good backing behind it. So what these initiatives really should be, and this, I think, in certain parts of the world, culturally could be a little bit difficult, is that when you're in this part of the strategy, you need to be more top-down. You need to take more ownership from the C-suite in saying that these are the prioritized bets. The bottom-up approach, it is so important, but it comes later. It's not time yet, because you're still in an area of prioritization and resource allocation. And obviously, what ends up being prioritized might be an idea that is coming from the bottom up. So I'm not saying no to that, but I'm saying that the individuals, the ultimate custodians of strategy, which is the C-suite, they need to own prioritizations all the way through.
So great ideas and great priorities can come
for sure
from the rank and file, if you like, from the bottom up.
And most often does.
And most often do. But once they have been nominated as a priority, in the early stage of this stuff, it is absolutely the responsibility of the C-suite to set those tight parameters. First of all, they've got to make sure the priorities are few in number. We've heard that. But they've also got to be great in detail, and they've got to be fundamentally deliverable. So it's got to be clear. So when you're setting those parameters, it is, in that stage of the game, it is a top-down approach insofar as the people who are responsible for making the parameters clear and making the deliverables clear are the C-suite.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's a couple of reasons why this isn't happening. One of them being, and you mentioned the word detailed, and that's really interesting to me, because most of the people that rise to the level of the C-suite aren't really, I'm generalizing, but detail-oriented people.
Interesting.
They're people leaders.
Yeah.
And details are somebody else's problem, to be honest, in their frame of mind. I'm a big picture guy, girl, whatever, boss. The problem with that approach is that there's like operational details, really practical stuff, like how does the printer work? Sure, ignore that question. But there's strategic details, which is all the difference between a very well laid out strategy where different parts of the strategy actually complements each other. That truly does matter. And those are details that you need to understand. So say, for example, what are details in a strategic initiative? It's understanding, for example, the milestones across, okay, we need to be there in 3 years. What does that actually mean in 2 years, in 1 year, this quarter? And understanding when the plans then emanate bottom up, is this plan ambitious enough for us to reach that target over there? So details can matter sometimes, but they're all kind of masked around this idea of I'm not a details person.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because we're in a sort of cult of the people person. We're in a cult of the great generalist. And I don't mean cult in a negative sense. You know, a lot of these things that these types of individuals do are very important to business. But you seem to be implying that there are too few technicians in the C-suite, and we need more of them.
It's a good way of putting it. I've usually talked about you need to be operational in what's strategic. That's the way that I have come to explain it to the C-suite. And what that enables me to do is to say, you need to actually look at your schedule. And that's a cheeky challenge to whoever is listening to this as well. We know that the amount of time that you need to actually allocate to these kind of change initiatives is quite large. And if you're talking, it's going to be different depending on where you're at in the company. But from the C-suite, roughly, if you want to be in the high performance segment, you dedicate roughly 30% of your time towards strategy. Meaning that 70% of what you do is still going to be pretty reactive, answering emails, being at customer visits and so forth. But actually 30% of your time, that is when you are going through plans, when you are rallying troops, communicating, doing all of this stuff that has to do with strategy. And 30%, when you think about it, that's a day and a half per week.
Yeah.
Not in January, just around the conference time.
No.
Week in, week out. That's a lot of time.
Yeah, and the rallying the troops, it's interesting you use those phrases, rallying the troops and communicating. Because this book's full of mind-blowing facts, but there's another fact in this book, or a contention, that only about 13% by your research of employees even understand or know what their companies are. Yeah. So just over 1 in 10. So you could take any random company on the street and you go in the front door and ask them, only 1 in 10 employees, roughly, will be able to accurately identify the priorities of their own company. Yeah. So there's not much communication going on, and there's not much rallying of troops going on.
No, exactly. Actually, that core research is done by MIT. Right. It's a fantastic study, and it points out that what it discusses is alignment, like the coherence of do we understand what the priorities are, which is really before any type of execution comes, must know what are we supposed to execute, right? And it points out that directly in the C-suite, in that team, only half of them could. Half.
Only half of the C-suite?
Yeah, only half of the C-suite. So there's this grave overestimation of clarity.
Yeah.
And that's part of what I've been, like, what is my actual job? Part of my job is that. Getting these senior leaders who are exceptionally capable, likable, interesting, intelligent, to understand that, yes, it's clear in your head, because you spent all of these hours crafting this PowerPoint, but your ability to communicate it even to your own team is really lacking. And part of that is the concept of priority, because you're trying to communicate something that is super complex. So if you decrease the number of goals, it's way more simple to communicate it.
Yeah.
And yes, it's true that study suggested that on an employee level, roughly 1 out of 10 could name the priorities. And with that statistic, it's not really that difficult to understand why we fail at the 90% rate.
Well, if only 1 in 10 of your employees on average understands the priorities, then it's likely that you're only going to succeed in 1 in 10 of your strategies.
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, the numbers align very interestingly. Yeah. Don't be too negative about this. This is a positive book. This is telling us how to improve this stuff. Yeah. While identifying the malaise, it is also a practical guide to improving our businesses.
It's mostly, almost exclusively, a practical guide on how to do it.
Absolutely. And you've got this great methodology which consists broadly of 5 components for successful strategy execution. Broadly speaking, what are they?
So one of the things that I've learned over all of these years of doing this is that you need to bring something simple to the table. Something that's easy to understand, easy to learn, as little new words to learn as you can. Then, having said that, strategy can sometimes be complex, but I do think, having implemented this methodology across many organizations by now, this methodology is easy to understand. So it consists of really 4 components. And then the 5th one, it's about how do you scale it effectively. But it's from a methodology standpoint, there are 4 components. 2 of them are related to more strategic planning, like the almost intellectual part of strategy, when you decide what to do and how to do it. The 3rd and 4th one, those are about execution. How do you get it done? So the first component is called most important goal. And we've already discussed it a bit. So the idea of prioritizing what truly matters. But the discipline in the book as well also goes into, well, how do you have this discussion within your team? How do you have multiple discussions in a hierarchy, maintaining alignment while still making these goals? Because you can't have a frontline team sharing the identical goal with the C-suite. So obviously there needs to be interpretations. But how do you maintain focus as strategy kind of cascades outwards? So that's the concept of most important goals. Once you've decided your most important goals, then it's about the second pillar, which is called strategic initiatives. It's about figuring out what's the most direct path to this goal, or the most efficient path. We discussed it as well. But that concept again digs into, well, how does that actually work? What is good? What is bad? What are the ins and outs from really the C-suite perspective of making really highly successful and clear strategic initiatives, how to communicate them and so forth. We've discussed these quite a bit already. So let's move over to concept 3 and 4. The third concept, it's called key activities.
Yeah.
So if you think about it from a team perspective, you've now decided your most important goals. You know what the strategic initiatives are. What can you contribute to this? So in a super simple analogy, say that your most important goal is to get into better shape. You might measure this by your weight or by the time that you can run a marathon, whatever. That measurement, that's going to be your MIG, probably your most important goal. But the question is, well, how do I improve?
There are a number of ways of getting there.
Yeah, there are a number of ways of getting there. But excellence, a lot of times, is a consequence of good habits. So in that example, it's probably going to be my key activities are probably going to be the amount of times a week I train. So it's not really difficult in terms of what's the actual behavior, but a lot of times there are going to be, especially if you think about it as change, which strategy is a lot of times, just the training itself might be the behavioral hurdle that you have a problem of kind of climbing. So you can understand that, yes, I need to hit the gym more, or whatever it might be. In a business context, it's obviously different things. And that's where the fourth component comes in, which is about, we call it strategic stand-ups, but it's a team process, which is only about trying to keep the whirlwind of your operational job outside of the door.
Just block out that noise.
Yeah. And just focus on taking commitments. As a group, I promise this week that I will train 3 times, because that's what we figured out that I need to do in order to hit my marathon time, whatever. And then we meet up next week and we debrief. Okay, you said 3 times last week, Johan. What did you actually end up doing? I did 2 or 4 or whatever. So there's this great feedback loop of just holding yourselves accountable to these activities that you've identified as the most impactful ones. And then you do this all throughout the company, and that can be really nice. So typically on a frontline team, you would start at, 9 a.m. on a Monday morning. You have your 15-minute session, you do the commitments. But what happens is that you can start escalating issues also within a company. So the team manager, after his or her meeting is done with his team or her team, moves into the regional manager's team. And he can bring with him, okay, my team is actually blocked by this issue. So you can start escalating issues a lot of the time. And that's one of the kind of frustrations, especially in big companies, that what really is keeping us from executing these strategies is that we are waiting for decisions, or this thing doesn't have a budget and it's a 6-week period until the steering group meeting where this can be solved actually ends up being. So you can be way more agile in this type of system as well.
You quickly identify stumbling blocks.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Just by having this 15-minute meeting on a Monday or whenever it is, but on a frequent basis.
Yeah.
You could suddenly identify, well, okay, we've got our goals, we've kept them low in number, 2 or 3. We've worked out exactly what it is we need to get there through our strategic initiatives. But having these strategic stand-ups allows us to identify on a frequent basis what are the stumbling blocks.
Yeah.
And the truth of any business, the life of any organisation, is that new stumbling blocks tend to present themselves without warning.
Yeah.
So unless we have these regular updates, suddenly we're hitting a block and nobody knows about it.
Yeah, and one of the forefathers of kind of these disciplines of execution was Stephen Covey. And he said that the enemy of strategy execution is your day job. And that's so true, because if you think about it again as change, you need to do more of something in these key activities. What's hindering you is probably you being reactive to your email, and you're just going through the motions of your daily job. Even though you know that in reality, I know it's good for my health if I hit the gym more. It's not really, the problem is not intellectual at this point, it's behavioral. So you need, especially if you're trying to affect change at scale, you need some type of support system in place, keeping people reminded of that this is what we said was the plan. We're trying to keep ourselves to the plan at the level of behaviors.
I think the getting fit one's a really interesting one. I personally struggle in the winter to keep fit when I can't mountain bike because the conditions are so bad. So this winter I've started doing a running regime, which has really paid off in terms of my fitness. But what I found was exactly as you described, is that if I had a sort of broad ambition to go for a run, a 10K run once or twice a week, I wouldn't do it because I'd not worked out when I had a slot in my timetable when that run would be done,
Yeah.
when I had a backup plan if it was chucking it down with rain,
Yeah.
and half the time I didn't do enough distance in that week because I kept hitting a stumbling block.
Yeah.
When I made it part of a proper strategic initiative and had regular updates with myself and said, right, okay, I need to get to 15K this week.
Yeah.
How am I going to get to it? Well, when am I going to do the first 10 and when am I going to do the latter 5? If I hit a stumbling block, what's my plan B? I suddenly managed to do it. And it wasn't.
Did you have in your wardroom or wherever, did you have one of those things that you could check off? I did this training session.
I just used Strava.
Okay.
To check back on whether I did it.
Yeah.
And as you say, it wasn't an intellectual challenge, nor, I may say, was it a challenge of will. It wasn't that I didn't want to do it. It's that other parts of life, my day job, got in the way. And by day job, I mean that as an analogy. It started raining, or my son had something going at school that he needed picking up for. And when the time that I'd given myself at sort of 5 o'clock in the afternoon or 6 o'clock in the evening to do this run had suddenly disappeared, and I had no plan B.
Yeah.
But by actually accepting that sometimes stumbling blocks were going to get in the way and giving myself regular updates, I was able to actually achieve my goals most weeks.
Yeah, and I think about it when it comes, if we move out of kind of the personal sphere more into the organizational, and when you start thinking about the structure of things, how do we build a structure that's kind of self-sustaining? I think one of the beauties with the system is that you can, for each and every employee of the company, make a really clear connection between what are you doing on a weekly basis that has this perfectly clear red line all the way up through this is the kind of company overall most important goals. And that's super unclear for a lot of, like, I would argue most employees. Like, what I do on a weekly basis truly matters for the long-term strategy of this company. I don't think that many people feel that kind of connection. So, and that's why I mentioned feedback loops before, how this strategic stand-up is a great tool for leaders not to make accountability something punitive. But because what you can do is that you can just reinforce positive behaviors. Like, awesome, you did 2 runs last week. Even though your goal was 3 runs, your baseline was 0.5.
Yeah.
So like the acceleration is huge anyway from where you're coming. And then obviously in a group setting, there's a certain amount of peer pressure that comes into that as well. Nobody wants to be the guy that said it was raining on Tuesday morning, so I didn't go out to run. No. Because it was raining for everyone.
It's raining for everybody.
Everybody has an email. Everybody has clients. Like,
everyone's busy.
Yeah.
You know, it rains. You get emails. You get difficult phone calls.
Yeah.
That's life.
Yeah.
Find a plan B. Find a way through, accepting that those things are going to come to you.
Yeah. And I think it might be worth having a quick discussion as well about kind of the anatomy of key activities. Why is it so impactful? So the science behind it is really behavioral science, and it goes back to kind of our cavemen and women brains in terms of how do we work. And there's a couple of things that were really suiting for that time that doesn't suit us that well in kind of the modern office environment. So one thing that is really clear is that we're great at reacting to stuff.
Yeah.
So stuff that is all around us in our everyday life, like notifications on our phones. Those are drawing your attention
100%.
100%.
Yeah.
Even though you know that probably this reel from Instagram is not the most important thing, your attention is immediately drawn into it, or this email, or whatever it might be. So part of a key activity is making sure that, or at least recognizing that one thing that we truly struggle with is proactive behaviors.
Yeah.
Things that wouldn't have happened unless you were there to create them. So when you're designing key activities, looking at stuff that is proactive is really impactful, because those are the things that, and the second point here is that we struggle a lot with delayed gratification. So when we're talking about key activities that are super relevant for strategy, the payoff horizon might be a year or 2 from now, which means that this urgent email that came from a client of mine feels much more important for this hour, what I would spend this hour on. So I can always kind of delay this strategic task to next week. But what you end up doing is that there's just this perpetual cycle of you delaying it just one more week.
It's this problem with deferred gratification, which as humans we really struggle with. We struggle it's often talked about in terms of children, but actually we're all children to some extent in that way. As we get older, we become a little bit better at deferring gratification than we were when we were 7 or 8 or 2 or 3 years of age. But we never really make our peace with deferred gratification unless we can train ourselves to do so.
And I think that's the combination of defining key activities and the strategic stand-up. What you actually end up doing is creating this kind of artificial substitute for both making sure that you have gratifications more often because you meet in a team setting and getting praised for the runs that you did last week in front of your peers. That matters. So you have this kind of reward cycle and you have this ability from your manager to be more concrete in terms of the feedback that he or she gives you. So that's great. But you're also creating this artificial deadline around an activity that's usually stuck in this perpetual next week's problem zone into actually my deadline is Friday for this. That's when the deadline is. Even though that's just a broken down deadline of that's the cadence that we need to have every week. It's still a deadline.
The mini milestone creates a deadline.
Yeah, exactly. And that kind of satisfies that inadequacy that our caveman brain still carries. You need those cycles. And then the final thing is that typically like growth happens outside of the comfort zone a lot of the times. So even though if you haven't trained for 10 years, training is really daunting.
Yeah.
Like even going out for a walk is a big thing. And the same is true no matter what you're trying to do, booking more senior stakeholders for your clients or whatever the key activity is in your specific setting. So if you haven't done it before, that is uncomfortable. So there is this element of you needing a little bit of a forceful nudge because you can get people to understand that behavior in a group setting when you're discussing what's the most efficient way to get to your most important goal. Training. Because then you're in this kind of intellectual part of your brain. You're not in your fight or flight, the amygdala part of the brain, when you're confronted with, now it's time to train. So if you have accepted this in a group setting with your team, that these are the behaviors that we want to do, then we're just holding you accountable to what you already committed to doing. So it's this way of not, or at least we talked about top-down and bottom-up before.
Yeah.
So it is a top-down process. In a way that we say that, yes, you need to define behaviors that we will hold you accountable to. You define the behaviors, though. So that's on you. So if you're not doing it, you can pretty quickly, as a more senior manager, have a conversation around, wasn't training a big part of you running a faster marathon anymore? Like, has that changed? Have you started doing something else? Or is it just the behavior resistance left here?
Yeah.
So it's a way of kind of handling resistance as well further down the line.
So that's 1, 2, 3, and 4.
Yeah.
There's a fifth.
Yeah, and you talked about Strava as one of your kind of apps that helps you along the way. The same thing is true here. The fifth component is how do you bring scale to kind of this behavior change? And where strategy is coming from, I think it's kind of funny if you talk about it. Like, could you imagine a CFO that didn't have a financial system? Like a modern one, sitting there with a ledger and one of those green caps on and doing debit and credit by hand, or a sales manager without a CRM system, for example. That's kind of the level of digitalization that the CEO has for strategy. They use PowerPoint, sometimes Excel. That's the current state of how digitalized strategy is. And I think there are 2 reasons why that is. The first reason is that the ones that are guiding the CEO, typically, they're consultants. Their business model isn't really catered to building scalable digital products to enable this. They want to sell consulting hours. That's how they make money. So there isn't an incentive from the consultant side of things of changing this. Another one from more the tech side of things, they don't understand strategy. That's not their world. They have a bottom-up approach in almost anything they do. They're user-centric first, meaning employee-level user-centric. So there's this vacuum in terms of who will digitalize the CEO when it comes to strategy. And that's really what I've been practically working on now the last 5 years, building concrete digital tools to achieve scale for strategy. And the ambition here is, how can we deliver the same kind of outcome that you could generate through consulting by using technology to scale it to a point where it's affordable?
Yeah.
And that's the point. And it doesn't really matter, to be honest, for this interview, if you use my software or not. I'm just saying that you shouldn't use PowerPoint or Excel for strategy. They're built for different things.
And you probably can't afford the consultancy hours that it would take you if you did it with human beings.
Exactly, because you would need too many consultants. And what ends up happening is that you make this huge push for half a year and realize, I can't afford to pay these people anymore. Half a year is way too short a time to make the change that you need to affect for it to have a really good impact. So yeah.
So the golden ticket is somewhere in between, which is digitization designed by consultants that understand strategy.
Yeah, exactly. And there are a few, and this is actually, like, this area is so new that more competitors would just be good for everyone. And there are a couple of really interesting companies that are coming up, both from the States, from Israel, from obviously Sweden, where we're based, one in Germany. So more and more people are really understanding it and building it. So I expect this to change. But it also is a little bit of a question of what's the digital maturity within the C-suite as well. And there's this great study that just came out last year from McKinsey that said that they defined like digital capability according to some, I actually don't know the specifics of how they measured it, but they said that if you had a digital proficient C-suite, because they have this other index that they measure it to, which is like a corporate financial health index that measures growth, profit, and a bunch of other metrics that they kind of standardize what does good corporate performance look like. And they can then start correlating a bunch of factors versus that index, right? Yeah. And they have all of this data, which is fantastic from a science perspective. And they said that having corporate digital proficiency in the C-suite increased financial performance with 40%. So that's a really big question now on the board level now as well. Do we have a CEO that understands digital or is more in an analog environment?
Do we have many of those?
We do more and more. And that's where kind of my more operational field is emerging. We do have more and more CEOs that are more digitally capable. Are they at the level of the majority of CEOs? Absolutely not. So the statistics is 6% of CEOs have some type of software for strategy. So that's where like 94% are executing in PowerPoint.
Yeah.
Which is built to communicate.
Yeah. Not to deliver. Wow. So now the book's published. Congratulations.
Thank you.
What are your big hopes for it?
To inspire action more than anything. My fundamental belief is that the things that we need to fix aren't necessarily that difficult to fix. It's pretty basic stuff. Even though we all get it wrong, it's still pretty basic. It's simple to learn. And I hope that whoever is watching this, whoever is reading the book is kind of prodded into action, taking this into their own ecosystem, sharing these ideas with their management team, within their systems that they operate. That's the ultimate ambition. Larger than that, I think if we can become better at achieving our goals, both from almost like the spiritual sense of being satisfied with life, but also the ability to combat the big issues that we are facing, that's an important mission. And anybody can contribute to this. Anybody. And obviously, that's also part of the execution revolution, that we need more people to contribute to this. Believe in it, take it with them, activate it in their own context.
You need to find more people like you that are passionate about this.
And people are passionate about it. I think becoming better at achieving your goals, whatever they are, that's potentially life-changing. But especially if you're an up-and-coming manager, let's say, the pace of change will never be as slow as it is now moving forward. Yeah. So if you think about it as what are the skills that I really should focus on obtaining during this period of my career, really no matter if I am 60 years old, I still have a couple of years left to make an impact. But even more importantly, if you're in your 20s, 30s, 40s, you have many years probably as a leader as well to go in your career. The ability to affect change is going to be way more important in the future than it already is. And it's already really, really, really important.
Yeah.
So that's why you should care. It will impact your ability to further your own career and have an interesting, successful life.
There's an old saying, isn't there, about the rate of change. If you think the rate of change is fast now,
exactly,
wait until tomorrow.
Yeah.
And it's a really interesting point that you make, that if there's one thing that we as business leaders, business executives need to do, it is to become better at changing.
Yeah.
Because if things are changing fast now, you ain't seen nothing yet.
Exactly.
It's why it's a really seminal book at an important time to get people's mindset into that change mindset and to make things happen.
And it's doable. I mean, the principles that we discuss in the book, discussed here today, they are completely doable by anybody. And they are applicable in a business setting, sure, and it's written in a business setting, but they're completely applicable in your private lives, if you work through NGOs or in other fields of expertise. They're relatable to anyone. So I do think that it's a very worthwhile read for anyone.
It certainly is. Johan, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.